The chilling story of a family whose generations died on the same date is one that continues to baffle historians, scientists, and the general public alike. It's a tale that doesn't fit neatly into the categories of ordinary tragedy, nor does it adhere to any typical explanations. For those who first came across it, the story unfolded with an eerie rhythm, a rhythm that began centuries ago and echoed throughout time, resonating across the generations of a single bloodline. The date, that ominous day that would claim the lives of each member, lingered like a shadow over this family from the beginning of the 19th century. With each successive generation, the deaths followed a disturbingly predictable pattern, all occurring on the same date. The date itself, an unremarkable one in the grand timeline of history, becomes the source of fascination, horror, and unanswered questions. Was this family cursed, bound to this dreadful fate by some supernatural force, or was it merely a coincidence too impossible to ignore? The eerie repetition of deaths across generations suggests that this was no ordinary family. What could have caused such an inexplicable pattern? Was it divine retribution, an ancestral vendetta, or perhaps a hidden scientific explanation yet to be uncovered? On the surface, it may seem like the type of mystery that is best left for Gothic novels or supernatural thrillers. Yet this story is grounded in history, in a real family from a small town in Wales where the strange and tragic phenomenon unfolded. The chilling aspect of it isn't just the idea of untimely death that befell them, but the impossibility of their shared fate. From father to son, mother to daughter, each generation appeared to be trapped in an inescapable loop of death that they could neither avoid nor escape. What made this case even more unsettling were the reactions of the people who were closest to the family. Some believed that the family had been touched by an ancient curse, perhaps the work of a malevolent spirit or an unresolved wrongdoing that had haunted their bloodline. Others, however, pointed to something more natural but no less terrifying, the possibility of genetic inheritance, a medical condition passed down through the ages that somehow made this family more susceptible to dying on that specific date. Could genetics play a part in deciding the time and nature of a person's death? Was it a result of the body being predisposed to succumb to some environmental or hereditary trigger? As the story of the family's deaths unfolded across the generations, it became clear that there was something deeply unsettling about the precise nature of their fate. Not only did the deaths occur on the same day, but they often involved similar symptoms, and there was an undeniable sense of foreboding that clung to the family's legacy. In a way, the family became synonymous with their tragedy, and their deaths became a defining feature of their identity, overshadowing everything else about them. But what would it have been like to live in a family haunted by this kind of prophecy? The burden of knowing that you were destined to die on the same date as your ancestors must have been a psychological weight so heavy that it would have been nearly impossible to ignore. For every child born into the family, there must have been an underlying fear, an understanding that they, too, might be fated to die on that same date. Did the knowledge of this impending fate affect their decisions, their relationships, or their very sense of self? Would it cause them to live with a sense of dread, always looking over their shoulder, wondering when the final day would arrive? It's easy to imagine the emotional toll it would take on any family subjected to such a curse. Parents who would have been unable to protect their children, knowing that they, too, would eventually be claimed by the same relentless force. Children raised with the understanding that their time would come, but not knowing exactly when. The endless waiting, the creeping dread, the fear that one day they, too, would fall victim to the cruel hands of fate. And then there are the questions that seem to arise with no answers. Why this family? Why were they singled out? Were there other families in the same town or region that experienced similar patterns of death? Or was this truly a singular, one-of-a-kind curse, reserved for just them? With no clear explanation, the mystery only deepens. The town itself, where the family's story unfolded, became an unwitting participant in the narrative. How did the local community view the family? Did they see them as outcasts, forever tied to their tragic fate, or were they seen as victims of some incomprehensible force? It's likely that over time, the family's story became a source of local folklore, passed down through the generations as an eerie reminder of the power of fate, or of curses, or whatever unseen force might be at work in the world. What makes this case even more intriguing is that despite the widespread fascination with curses and supernatural events, there was little actual documentation of the family story. Much of what we know today has been passed down through oral history, through rumors, and through scattered journal entries, letters, and town records. In some ways, this only adds to the mystery. The lack of concrete evidence somehow makes the story even more compelling. What can we trust? What parts of the tale are fact, and which ones are distorted by the passage of time and the vagaries of human memory. Even as historians dug into the family's past, searching for answers, there was still something hauntingly elusive about their deaths. The family members who lived through these events would have seen their relatives die on that fateful day, and in doing so, witnessed the finality of the curse firsthand. They would have felt the crushing weight of inevitability that hung over their every move, and yet, there was nothing they could do to alter the course of their fate. For those who came after, the mystery only deepened, as the question persisted. Was it truly a curse, or was it something far more complicated? Could the answers lie in genetics, in a rare and undiscovered disorder that caused the family to die in such a specific and predictable way? Or was there a more sinister explanation at hand, one that reached beyond the rational and into the realm of the supernatural? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between science and folklore, somewhere in the shadowy space where the two overlap. The mystery of this family's tragic deaths is a story that has persisted across the centuries, and it continues to captivate the imagination of anyone who hears it. It's a mystery that won't be easily solved, no matter how many theories are proposed or how much research is conducted. The answers, if they exist at all, may never fully be revealed. What remains, however, is the haunting legacy of a family marked by an invisible force, a dark fate that looms over them and refuses to be shaken off. Their deaths, strange, unsettling, and inexplicable, continue to serve as a chilling reminder of the mysteries that remain just out of reach, forever lurking in the shadows. The story of this family, bound by an identical death date across generations, will live on in the minds of those who dare to explore it. And as long as it does, the questions will remain unanswered, forever fueling the curiosity and fear that come with the unknown. The family's tragic saga may not have an easy explanation, but that, in itself, is what makes it so powerful. In a world that demands answers, sometimes it is the unanswered questions that leave the most lasting impact. And the story of this family, who died on the same date through the generations, is one of those mysteries that will continue to haunt us for generations to come. To understand the mystery that would later come to be known as the curse of the family whose members died on the same date across generations, one must first immerse oneself in the world they inhabited, early 19th century Wales. At this point in time, the country was a place where the past and present collided in fascinating and often unsettling ways. It was a land steeped in rich cultural traditions, but also one where old superstitions and tales of the supernatural still held sway in the minds of the people. To grasp why the strange deaths of this family would have been both terrifying and fascinating, it is crucial to explore the environment in which their story unfolded. The early 1800s in Wales was a period of change. While the country had been largely rural for centuries, the Industrial Revolution was beginning to take hold. The landscape of the valleys and hills, known for their natural beauty and steeped in folklore, was starting to shift under the pressure of industrialization. Mines and factories dotted the land, and while these changes brought economic growth, they also introduced new sources of tension and division. The rural communities that had once lived in isolation were now becoming entangled with larger, more urbanized forces, and this created a friction that would ripple through society in many different ways. At the same time, the hold of ancient beliefs remained strong. The supernatural was not a thing relegated to fiction or imagination in these parts. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life. Witches, spirits, and omens were common features of folklore that were passed down from generation to generation. People in rural Wales were deeply attuned to the natural world, and many believed that unseen forces were constantly at play, subtly guiding or disturbing the events of their lives. For them, the boundary between the known and the unknown was often blurred. Life was seen through a lens shaped by superstition, and things like death, illness, and misfortune were often thought to be influenced by forces beyond human control. In this context, the family at the center of the mystery would have been viewed through a particularly sinister lens. It was one thing to have a sudden, unexpected death in the family, a tragic accident or an illness that claimed someone too soon, but it was entirely another thing to have a family in which every generation's death followed a precise, unchanging pattern. The date was significant to the people of the time, especially in a place like Wales, where the passage of seasons and cycles of life was celebrated and feared in equal measure. Time itself was seen as a force, immutable, unyielding, and powerful. To die on a certain date, the same day year after year, would have felt like an intrusion of something unnatural, perhaps even malevolent, into the rhythms of life that the people knew and respected. During the early 19th century, there was a significant divide between the rural folk and the emerging scientific minds of the time. The Enlightenment and the rise of rational thought had introduced a new wave of thinking about the world, one that was rooted in logic, reason, and empirical evidence. But even as this rationality gained ground in cities and universities, the countryside remained a place where people were more likely to turn to superstition or folklore when faced with the inexplicable. In Wales, where the natural beauty of the land was coupled with the richness of its mythic traditions, the intersection of old beliefs and emerging modernity created a world of contradictions. This family story would force people to reckon with both realms, traditional belief and rational thought, and ask whether one had the power to explain the other. For the people living in the small communities of Wales during this period, the family's curse would not have been seen as a mere tragedy, but as something far darker, a mark of misfortune, perhaps even a warning. The death of a family member, especially one who died in such an unusual and unsettling manner, would have sent ripples through the community. News would spread quickly, and whispers would fill the air. People would have wondered why the family was marked in such a way. Did they have enemies? Were they being punished for something? The town would have searched for answers in the only ways they knew, through their belief systems, through their experiences, and through the stories of the past. This is where the clash between the old ways and the new becomes important. In some corners of society, people were beginning to question the idea of fate and destiny. Scientific thinkers were beginning to develop new ideas about biology, medicine, and human behavior, though these ideas were still in their infancy. Disease, once thought to be the work of evil spirits or curses, was now being understood through a more rational, medical lens. But this family's deaths on the same date, year after year, seemed to defy the explanations offered by the emerging scientific community. Could it truly be the result of a strange genetic predisposition, or was it something else entirely? The fact that the family story did not easily fit into either worldview, the old superstitions or the new science, made it all the more intriguing and frightening. The idea of curses was nothing new in Wales, a country steeped in ancient traditions. Folklore abounded with stories of families marked by tragedy, towns haunted by ghosts, and individuals who had crossed paths with forces they did not understand. It was entirely plausible that the family in question would be seen as victims of an ancient curse, passed down through generations for some forgotten sin or wrongdoing. Such curses were often linked to broken promises, vengeful spirits, or old feuds that had been lost to time. In the case of this family, it's possible that some believed they were being punished for something their ancestors had done, something that had rippled down through the generations, manifesting in their inevitable, tragic deaths. Yet, at the same time, the emergence of scientific thought in the early 19th century opened up the possibility that the family's fate could be explained in a more rational way. Genetics was still in its early stages, but ideas about heredity were beginning to circulate. Could it be that some rare genetic disorder was responsible for this pattern? Perhaps the family members were dying of a condition that caused them to perish on the same date, a rare condition that caused them to succumb to the same malady at the same point in time. There was a growing understanding of diseases like tuberculosis, which could strike with deadly precision. Could something like this be the key to explaining the mystery? But even with these emerging scientific ideas, the pattern of death on a specific date still seemed far too precise to be merely biological. Could it truly be coincidence? The skepticism of modern science and the devotion to superstition in rural Wales created a fascinating dynamic where both camps, the believers in the old ways and the rational thinkers, would have seen the story through different lenses. To some, the curse was an undeniable fact. To others, it was a tragic mystery that had yet to be solved. Both sides struggled to reconcile what they knew about the world with the dark and perplexing events unfolding before them. In Wales, the landscape itself played a role in shaping these beliefs. The rugged mountains, deep valleys, and dense forests of the country were not just a beautiful backdrop for daily life. They were also a place where myths took root. The land seemed alive with stories, and the people were deeply attuned to the ebb and flow of natural forces. It was a world where strange occurrences were often given mystical explanations, and death, especially untimely or unexplained death, was a powerful force in the collective imagination. For the family at the center of this mystery, their story was more than just a tragedy. It was a phenomenon that demanded attention. Whether seen through the lens of folklore or science, their deaths were not easily explained. As they died, generation after generation, on that same fateful date, the world around them began to see them not as ordinary people, but as something else, figures caught in a web of fate, or perhaps even in something darker. In this strange and unsettling time, where old beliefs and new discoveries collided, the family story would come to symbolize the tension between superstition and reason, the unknown and the known. It was a tale of death, but also a tale of the unknown forces that shaped lives and destinies in ways no one could fully understand. As the mystery unfolded, it would continue to cast a long shadow over Wales, and even beyond, sparking endless questions and theories that would last for generations. The family at the heart of this mystery, whose deaths were marked by an eerie precision, each dying on the same date across generations, was not merely an ordinary family. They were a unique bloodline, bound together by a history that seemed to defy both logic and time. Each member of this family carried with them a legacy, not just of their forebears but also of the haunting repetition that tied them to their inevitable fates. To understand the gravity of their story, one must delve deeper into their lives, their personalities, and the strange fate that seemed to hover over them, following them from one generation to the next. The first known death in the family took place in the early 19th century, and it was an event that would set the stage for a terrifying pattern. The person at the center of this initial tragedy was a man, a father perhaps, or a young adult, whose life seemed unremarkable at first glance. He was of common stock, born into a modest household, and lived a life that mirrored the lives of many of his peers, working hard, raising a family, and navigating the simple struggles of rural life in Wales. But it was the circumstances surrounding his death that marked him as different, and it would forever alter the trajectory of his family. When this individual passed away, the date was not just any ordinary day. It was a date that, as the years progressed, would become as important to the family as their last name. His death was sudden, unexpected, and shrouded in mystery. There were whispers, of course, within the small community. Some claimed that it was a natural death, a sudden illness or an accident, but others began to speculate that something darker was at play. It didn't help that the man's death occurred on a day that held no particular significance in the wider world, but to those who knew the family, it would soon become known as the day of death, a date that would come to define the family's identity in ways they could not have imagined. The death of this first individual was just the beginning. Over the next few decades, as new generations of the family were born, it became clear that something more than coincidence was at work. When the man's children came of age, they too seemed to be fated to die on the same date that had claimed their parents' life. This repetition was no longer seen as just a strange anomaly. It was a pattern, undeniable and relentless. One by one, each member of the family who lived long enough to grow old met their end on the same day, and the dates didn't change. They didn't die in the winter or in the summer. They didn't die young or old. They died on that one, singular day that held such ominous power over their bloodline. It wasn't just the death itself that was curious. The manner in which each family member died also bore unsettling similarities. Some were believed to have died in their sleep, while others suffered from mysterious illnesses that appeared to strike with fatal precision. And yet, no matter the cause, the date remained the same. It was as though the family had been set to a clock that would strike its final hour only when the time was right. And that time, always, was on the same day of the year. As the generations passed, the family's name became synonymous with tragedy. Their story was whispered among the townspeople, passed down through the generations like a legend, a ghost story that refused to die. Some felt sympathy for the family, seeing them as unfortunate victims of fate, while others grew to fear them, as if their cursed legacy could somehow be transferred to anyone who came too close. But what was it that made this family's fate so inexplicable? What could have caused such a pattern to unfold, one that seemed almost designed, as if some external force was guiding the hand of death? The family members themselves, aware of the curse that hung over them like a dark cloud, lived under the constant shadow of this inevitable fate. Imagine what it would have been like to grow up in such a family. From an early age, the children would have been taught to understand the significance of the date, to know that one day, it too would claim them. This knowledge must have been both a curse and a burden, a heavy weight that could never be escaped. How could one live a full life, knowing that your death would be predetermined? Could it affect how you lived, how you loved, how you fought against the inevitability of your fate? How would it shape your relationships with your children, your spouse, your friends? Would you live your life to the fullest, or would the knowledge of your future death cast a permanent shadow over everything you did? In this way, the family became prisoners of their own legacy. They were bound not just by blood but by a date that held the power to define them, to bind them in ways they could not escape. Their deaths were not just an unfortunate coincidence. They were an event that, in the end, seemed to take on a life of its own. Each death reinforced the other, creating a cycle that was as terrifying as it was inevitable. The family members themselves, despite the dread that clung to their name, were not entirely defined by their deaths. They were people, too, people with hopes, fears, and desires. Some were known for their strength and resilience, others for their kindness and compassion. But for all their individuality, they could not escape the shadow of their fate. Even the smallest of their joys and triumphs seemed diminished by the knowledge that their end would come, always, on that one fateful date. Did they ever try to fight back against this curse? Did they attempt to break the pattern, or did they resign themselves to it, accepting the inevitable as an inescapable part of their existence? As the years turned into decades, and the generations rolled by, the family's tragic pattern became a source of fascination and fear. Those who lived around them were drawn to the mystery, but also kept at a distance, not wanting to be too closely associated with a family that seemed to be haunted by death. The family story was a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to children to keep them on the straight and narrow. It was a story that seemed to transcend the ordinary, a tale that was too strange to be believed but too real to ignore. Some began to speculate about the origins of the curse. Was there something in the family's past that could explain this tragedy? Had they committed some grave sin or made an ancient enemy that had cursed them for generations? Was it the work of a vengeful spirit, a restless ghost who had found a way to tie the family's fates together in death? Or was it something more tangible, more rooted in the natural world, a genetic predisposition, a rare disease, a hereditary condition that led to this same tragic end? As time went on, the questions continued to mount. With each new death, the mystery grew deeper. Was there a logical explanation for the strange pattern? Or was this, as some believed, a true curse? The more one tried to understand, the more the mystery seemed to deepen. And with each new generation that died, the family story took on an even darker, more tragic quality. The inevitable deaths on the same date seemed to become an unbreakable chain, with each family member a link in that chain, powerless to escape the pattern that had been set for them. As the last generation came to face their fate, the weight of history must have been a heavy burden. Were they the last? Would the curse continue to haunt their descendants, or had they finally come to the end of the line? Was there any way to break the chain, or was this simply a family destined to die on the same date for as long as time would allow? The family's tale is one of tragedy and mystery, yes, but it is also a reminder of the power that fate, history, and the unknown can hold over individuals and families. It serves as a testament to the way that destiny can shape lives, and how the past can echo down through generations in ways we can never fully understand. Their deaths, each one more tragic and mysterious than the last, became a part of the fabric of history, an unsettling reminder that some things are beyond our control, and that even in the face of death, we are often powerless to break the chains that bind us to our fate. The death of the first family member on that fateful day was only the beginning of a chilling saga that would span generations. Over time, it became clear that this was no mere coincidence, but a pattern, a sequence of events that seemed almost designed by some unseen hand, woven into the very fabric of the family's existence. As the years passed, each successive generation found themselves caught in the same web, bound by the same sinister force, as their deaths followed the same unnerving pattern, occurring on the same exact date as those who came before them. The story of this family, from the outside, seemed to transcend ordinary tragedy, taking on a shape that suggested something more supernatural, something beyond the grasp of rational explanation. But as the mystery deepened, so too did the speculation surrounding it. Was it truly a curse, or was there some other force at play? The second generation to fall victim to this pattern was perhaps the most significant, as it confirmed that the strange death date was not a mere anomaly, but an undeniable reality. The family, already devastated by the loss of their first member, began to realize that this dark legacy was not just an isolated event. As the next child reached adulthood, the family waited with a sense of dread that had slowly crept into their lives. Could they escape the fate that had befallen their forebay? Was it inevitable? On the fateful day that had claimed the life of the first member, the second generation member, too, passed away, again on that same day, under eerily similar circumstances. As the years turned to decades, this same pattern continued, and it became evident that the family was cursed, or at least, trapped in a strange cycle. Each new death added a layer of confusion and fear to the growing mystery. Were these deaths simply the result of some genetic predisposition, some unexplainable medical condition that caused each member to die on that very same day, or was it something more? The exact nature of the pattern made it impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. It was as though the family had been branded by fate, with each successive death cementing the idea that they were part of something larger than themselves, something they could neither control nor understand. The people around them, Those who had watched the first generation fall and had witnessed the second member's untimely death began to speculate. Whispers ran through the town as people tried to make sense of what was happening. Some said that the family had angered the gods, or perhaps had made some terrible bargain in their past, and that this was their punishment. Others spoke of supernatural forces, spirits, ghosts, or curses, that had descended upon the family, marking them for death on that specific day every year. The dates themselves were hauntingly regular, and while the deaths were attributed to natural causes or accidents, there was always a sense that something else was at play. The local community grew divided in their views of the family. Some felt sympathy, understanding that these individuals were victims of forces beyond their control. Yet, there were those who believed that the family was not merely unfortunate but cursed, a warning to others about the dangers of defying the unseen world. The pattern of death had not only affected the family's members but had also taken on a life of its own in the town's folklore. The people who lived around them, those who had seen the tragic cycle unfold, began to speak of the family in hushed tones, as if mentioning them aloud would somehow invite misfortune upon themselves. The family's curse became a part of the town's identity, a shadow that loomed over everyone who had ever known them. But the most chilling aspect of the deaths was that they didn't seem to discriminate. They didn't care whether the family member was old or young, healthy or sickly. The deaths came as they always did, on that same fateful day, taking their toll without regard for circumstance. This led to a growing sense of fear among the family members, who were forced to confront the idea that no matter how they lived their lives, their ultimate fate was already sealed. Each member, as they came of age, was likely to experience a mixture of dread and resignation as they approached the day of their own death. They had no choice but to live with the knowledge that they would die on the same date as those who came before them. It was a reality that shaped everything they did, a constant undercurrent of fear that must have colored their relationships and their decisions. It wasn't just the inevitability of death that loomed over them. It was the strangeness of the whole situation. To die on a certain day was one thing, but to die on that specific day, which had already claimed others before you, added a layer of mystery and terror that couldn't be easily explained away. It suggested that the family was not merely following some natural progression, but that there was an external force at play, something that was determining the outcome of their lives, as if they were characters in a story whose ending had already been written. This realization must have been a heavy burden for each new generation to bear, as the date of death approached with an ever-growing sense of dread and inevitability. Some of the family members, likely driven by a desire to break free from the oppressive weight of their fate, began to look for answers. Were there records that could explain the unusual pattern? Were there any clues buried deep in their history, in their ancestry, that could explain why this strange phenomenon had occurred? There were rumors of strange family secrets, hidden histories of forbidden relationships, unresolved feuds, and mysterious events that could hold the key to the curse. Some even claimed that the family had been involved in ancient rituals, dark pacts, or long-forgotten crimes, and that these actions had somehow doomed them to live and die on the same date. Others believed that the deaths were the work of a powerful, malevolent spirit or an ancient curse placed upon the family generations ago. Despite these speculations, no concrete answers were ever found. There was no document, no letter, no journal that could explain the pattern of death. Theories ranged from the plausible to the absurd, but no one, not even the family themselves, could find the truth. It was as if the mystery of their deaths had been woven into the very fabric of their existence, and no matter how hard they searched, they could not escape the shadow that loomed over them. The story continued to unfold in tragic increments, with each death reinforcing the idea that the family was caught in a never-ending cycle. As time passed, the pattern became clearer. The family was not just a group of individuals living ordinary lives, but a bloodline defined by a strange and inescapable fate. This fate transcended individual personalities, desires, and efforts. Whether the family members were good or bad, virtuous or flawed, it did not matter. The date was set, and they would meet their end on that day, with no room for deviation. As more generations passed, the family became increasingly isolated, both physically and emotionally. They withdrew from the larger community, perhaps in part because of the fear that their fate could somehow be passed on to others. They may have believed that the family's curse was contagious, that those who were too close to them would suffer the same fate. The family's isolation only deepened the sense of mystery, as those who lived around them could only look on with morbid fascination as the deaths continued, year after year. It is hard to imagine what it must have been like for each new generation to come of age knowing that their time was limited, that they too would be claimed by the same inexorable force. Did they resist? Did they try to break free from the pattern? Or did they accept it as part of who they were? Did they attempt to live normal lives? Or did they live in fear, always wondering when the day would come for them? The weight of the knowledge must have been unbearable at times, and it's possible that some members of the family found solace in the idea that their deaths, as tragic as they were, at least brought an end to the cycle. In the end, the pattern continued, and the family became a symbol of the inexplicable, a living testament to the strange forces that can shape lives, destinies, and histories in ways we cannot fully understand. The mystery of their deaths, and the date that claimed them, remains one of those eerie stories that defy explanation, leaving those who hear it to wonder if fate, superstition, or something darker was at play. The family's tragic saga reminds us that sometimes, the most frightening mysteries are the ones that can never be solved. As the tragic pattern of death continued through each generation, the family members themselves began to experience the weight of their fate in increasingly profound ways. Living under the shadow of an inescapable curse, or perhaps it would be more accurate to call it a curse of fate, became an unrelenting presence in their daily lives. The day of reckoning that had claimed the first family member and followed with terrifying consistency throughout the generations, grew to define not only the way others saw them but also the way they saw themselves. Each passing year, each new birth, was imbued with a sense of foreboding that rippled through every moment. The family's name became synonymous with tragedy, and their very existence seemed to be inextricably tied to a singular, unavoidable truth. They were doomed to die on that one, unchanging date. The pressure of knowing that their fate had been predetermined must have been unimaginable. To live with the understanding that no matter what one did, no matter the choices made or the paths chosen in life, there was a date, a specific day, that would claim their life was a burden too heavy to carry without some form of emotional or psychological toll. For each new generation, the awareness of the curse became a defining feature of their lives, shaping their sense of identity, their relationships with others, and their overall view of the world. This constant awareness of their impending death could have made the family members profoundly introspective, as they had little choice but to come to terms with the inevitability of their end. How would one approach life when the end was always visible on the horizon, just beyond the reach of time? Did they live in constant dread, counting the years until the inevitable day arrived? Or did they, in some way, accept their fate and live their lives as best they could, despite the dark cloud hanging over them? For those who were born into this family, there was no escaping the shadow of their ancestors' deaths. From an early age, the children would have been taught, if not directly told, that their fate had already been sealed. Parents, aware of the family's tragic history, would have undoubtedly warned their children to be vigilant as they grew older. This knowledge would have been imparted quietly but with a sense of finality, an understanding that their lives, though full of potential, were also marked by something beyond their control. The idea of living a normal life, of achieving great things or forging meaningful relationships, would have been difficult to maintain when every step taken was tainted by the knowledge that their time on earth would eventually come to a conclusion on that one, cursed date. But it was not just the fear of death that consumed the family. It was the growing uncertainty surrounding the nature of their fate. Was this something purely supernatural, a curse laid upon them by an unknown force, or was there something more mundane, something biological or scientific, that could explain why they died on the same day each year? As the family continued to face this grim reality, the idea of discovering the truth behind their deaths became more pressing. Were they the victims of an ancient curse, perhaps the result of some past sin committed by one of their ancestors? Or was there a medical explanation, a rare genetic disorder that caused them to succumb to death on that specific date, perhaps a reaction to some environmental factor or even a medical condition that struck with incredible precision? This uncertainty was deeply troubling, as it left the family members trapped between two worlds, the world of folklore and belief in supernatural forces, and the world of scientific rationalism that was beginning to gain prominence in the 19th century. Those who clung to the old ways of thinking might have viewed the family's deaths as the result of a malevolent spirit or a curse that had been passed down from generation to generation, one that was somehow beyond the realm of human understanding. They might have looked to the stars, to the moon, or to ancient rituals as the only explanation for why this family had been chosen for such a horrific fate. For them, the family's suffering was not only inevitable, but it was also beyond the scope of human intervention. On the other hand, more scientifically minded individuals might have looked at the family's history and tried to discern a rational explanation. Could it be that the deaths were the result of an inherited medical condition, one that caused the family members to die on that specific date, perhaps due to an extreme susceptibility to disease or some other form of physiological malfunction? The timing of the deaths, always on the same date, generation after generation, was so precise that it was hard to ignore the possibility that some natural, albeit rare, cause was at work. Yet, despite the rise of scientific theories in the early 19th century, no concrete explanation emerged that could account for the family's repeated deaths on that single, fateful day. The search for answers, whether supernatural or scientific, led the family members down increasingly darker paths. Some may have turned to local healers, spiritualists, or even priests in a desperate attempt to understand or break the curse. Others, perhaps more skeptical, would have turned to medicine, consulting doctors in the hope of uncovering a biological cause for their predicament. But in each case, the answers remained elusive. The more they searched, the more the mystery deepened, until the family members were left with only one harsh reality: they were trapped in a cycle from which there was no escape. For the family's younger generations, the struggle to break free from this oppressive fate was no less real. The knowledge that death was inevitable had a profound psychological impact. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown or the physical suffering that they feared. It was the realization that their lives, their entire existence, were marked by a singular event, the date of their death, that they could neither avoid nor change. This understanding shaped everything they did. Relationships were undoubtedly affected by this knowledge, as it would have been difficult for anyone to form lasting, deep connections knowing that their time with a loved one was limited. How could one plan for a future when that future was tied to a singular date, one that would come for them no matter what? The family's social isolation grew as their fate became more widely known. People in the community, once familiar with the family, began to distance themselves, either out of fear or pity. For some, the family's curse was a terrifying reminder that even the most ordinary lives could be touched by forces beyond comprehension. For others, the family represented a strange kind of tragedy, one that was impossible to fully comprehend but could not be ignored. As the years passed, the family became more and more insular, their fate a well-kept secret shared only among their own. They became a symbol of mystery and sorrow, a living warning that death, in all its mysterious forms, can sometimes be inescapable. As the generations passed, the questions surrounding the family's deaths became more pronounced. Were they truly the victims of a curse? If so, what had they done to deserve such a fate? Some might have asked whether their bloodline had been forever tainted by some ancient sin or transgression, one that had cursed them with this inescapable death. Others, more scientifically inclined, may have speculated that there was a rare condition at play, something so specific and unusual that it could explain the timing of each death. But as the family members aged and eventually succumbed to their fate, no answers ever seemed forthcoming. The mystery of their deaths, the reasons behind their singular fate, remained unanswered, and the family's tragic history grew ever more obscure as time went on. It is almost impossible to imagine what it must have been like for the last generations of this family, those who, perhaps, were the last to experience this cycle. Were they resigned to their fate? Did they accept it as an inescapable part of who they were, or did they fight against it, desperately searching for a way to break the pattern that had haunted them for so long? It's impossible to say for sure, but it's likely that the last members of the family, fully aware of the grim inevitability of their end, experienced a profound sense of despair, of helplessness. The curse, which had been passed down through the generations, was now nearing its end. Would it be broken, or would it continue, silently, until the last of them had perished? In the end, the family story is one of tragedy, mystery, and unanswered questions. Their fate, tied to a single date across generations, became both their greatest curse and their defining feature. They lived with a knowledge that few could ever truly comprehend, and as the years passed, they became both legends and warnings. Warnings that no matter how much we strive to understand the mysteries of life and death, some things remain forever beyond our grasp. The family story serves as a haunting reminder that some patterns, no matter how strange or inexplicable, are impossible to break. As the mystery of the family's deaths deepened, it was not just the immediate members of the family who were affected by the strange and unrelenting pattern of fate. The local community, too, found itself irrevocably shaped by the family's grim legacy. Over time, the family became a subject of fascination, fear, and reverence, a living mystery that lingered like a dark cloud over the town or village in which they lived. The dates of death, so consistent and chilling, became an integral part of local folklore. But perhaps more haunting than the whispered rumors and superstitions was the profound psychological impact that the family saga had on those who knew them. The community surrounding the family began to adopt an almost ritualistic approach to the deaths. Each year, as the cursed date approached, a heavy silence would descend on the village. People would remember, perhaps consciously, perhaps without thought, that this family, once so ordinary, would soon face another tragedy. The looming date became not just a point of dread for the family members but also for the entire town. The idea of living near such a place, where death seemed to be both omnipresent and inevitable, began to have a profound effect on the psyche of the people. The fear was palpable, but it wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was fear of what this pattern meant. It was as if the town collectively understood that the family represented something greater, a dark mirror reflecting the fragility of life and the inevitability of death. Over the years, this growing sense of fear transformed into a kind of local superstition. People began to wonder if the family's curse was something that could spread to others, if simply being near the family would bring misfortune. It wasn't enough to simply avoid them. People began to distance themselves as much as possible from the family's legacy. Children were warned to stay away, parents cautioned their young ones never to speak of them, and the townspeople looked at the family with a mixture of pity and suspicion. The family's very existence became an unsettling constant, as if they were a reminder that sometimes there was no rhyme or reason to why bad things happened. The family, already trapped within their own tragic fate, now became the subject of judgment and superstition from the community at large. This sense of isolation was compounded by the feeling that they were somehow marked by something unseen, something unnatural. The family members themselves, aware of their own impending deaths and the strange nature of their fate, began to withdraw further into themselves. Over time, they became something of a shadow in the town, a ghostly presence that was both feared and pitied. Their very lives seemed to be a constant reminder of the fragility of human existence, and their impending deaths, like a ticking clock, served as an uncomfortable backdrop to the lives of those around them. As the generations passed, and more family members met their end on the same day, the town's collective unease grew. There was no explanation that could fully satisfy the growing tension. Theories, scientific, supernatural, and everything in between, abounded, but none could truly explain the strange consistency of the deaths. The supernatural explanations were the most pervasive. Some claimed the family had offended some ancient god, or had been cursed by a witch or sorcerer from the past. Others believed that the family had angered spirits of their ancestors, who had chosen to punish them by ensuring that they would die on that same fateful date. In many ways, the family's existence became synonymous with these stories of the supernatural, and their tale was passed down through generations, gaining new layers of fear and mystery as it did. In parallel, the more scientifically inclined members of the community began to speculate about possible medical causes. Could there be a rare, hereditary disease responsible for these deaths? Perhaps a genetic predisposition that led to the family members' deaths on that particular date? Some theorists pointed to diseases that were known to strike with cyclical regularity, such as tuberculosis or certain kinds of heart disease, though the idea that these conditions could follow such a strict schedule seemed implausible. Others suggested that environmental factors, perhaps something in the soil or water near the family's home, might have contributed to this pattern, though no clear evidence ever emerged to support these ideas. The medical explanations were comforting in a way, as they offered a potential scientific explanation for the deaths, even if that explanation didn't quite match the chilling precision of the dates. Yet, despite these explanations, many continued to lean into the supernatural. Some local legends spoke of a curse placed upon the family by an ancestor, one who had angered a powerful being or committed some grave sin. The curse, so the story went, had been passed down from generation to generation, leaving each new member of the family with the same inescapable fate, to die on the same date as their forebears, bound by a force greater than themselves. These stories gained traction over time, and the family's deaths took on the aura of legend. What began as an unsettling series of coincidences or tragedies soon became an undeniable myth, a tale of fate and doom that was too strange to be ignored. The family story was not just a source of speculation, it became a source of fascination. People came from near and far, hoping to catch a glimpse of the cursed family, to see the ones who were destined to die on the same day, year after year. Some believed that seeing the family could somehow bring them closer to the supernatural, could give them answers to the questions that had puzzled the town for so long. Others were drawn by a morbid curiosity, eager to witness a real-life tragedy unfold in front of their eyes. The family, once just ordinary people, became a spectacle, a living, breathing piece of the unknown. But as the years wore on, the pressure on the family grew. The knowledge that they were the subject of so much fascination, so much fear, could not have been easy to bear. How could one live with the weight of being constantly watched, constantly speculated upon? And how could one live with the awareness that, no matter what they did, no matter how hard they tried to change, they would eventually succumb to the same fate that had claimed their ancestors. The burden of living under such scrutiny must have been unbearable, a constant reminder that they were, in many ways, a symbol of something darker, a warning, a curse, a living proof of the fragility of human life. Despite the ever-present fear and speculation, there was also a sense of resignation that seemed to take hold of the family over time. As the deaths continued, generation after generation, it was as if the family had come to accept their fate, as if they had no choice but to live in the shadow of the curse that had been placed upon them. Perhaps there was a sense of peace in this resignation, a quiet understanding that their deaths were not something they could control. Or perhaps it was simply the result of years of emotional and psychological strain, of coming to terms with the fact that they were living in a kind of limbo, where the past and future were forever tied to that one date. But even in this resignation, the family members were not without their human qualities. They still loved, they still dreamed, and they still fought against the inevitable. They tried to break the cycle, or at least find some meaning in their lives before the date arrived. They sought out answers, as anyone would in their position, trying to find a way out of the trap that had been set for them. But the truth remained, there was no way to escape. No matter what they did, no matter how they lived their lives, they would die on that date. In the end, the family's curse became not just a personal tragedy, but a symbol of something larger, of the ways in which fate, superstition, and the unknown can shape our lives in ways that defy logic and reason. Their story became a part of the town's folklore, a living, breathing reminder of the limits of human understanding, and the ways in which we are all, in the end, subject to forces far beyond our control. And as the family's story passed into history, it left behind a legacy that would haunt those who heard it for generations to come, a legacy of mystery, of fear, and of the inexplicable tragedy of a family bound to die on the same date, over and over again. As the family's tragic history continued to unfold, questions surrounding the curse that seemed to bind them grew more complex and unsettling. Over time, the inevitable deaths on the same date became less about the specifics of each individual's demise and more about the deeper questions it raised. Questions that extended beyond the family and into the very nature of life and death, fate, and free will. The town, the family's neighbors, and even the distant relatives who came to observe the unfolding tragedy began to ask themselves not just why this was happening, but what it meant. The family, at the center of it all, was locked in a struggle for meaning. No one who found themselves in their shoes could fully escape the weight of their own destiny. The knowledge that every passing year brought them closer to that fateful day was a constant presence. It hovered over them like a storm cloud, casting a shadow over every moment of their lives. For the family's younger generations, this knowledge could not have been easy to bear. How could one form lasting relationships, create a future, or even simply enjoy the small moments of life when you were fully aware that it would all come to an abrupt end on that one day? The mere anticipation of their end, creeping closer year after year, would have taken its toll on their ability to experience life fully, and certainly on their ability to experience joy. Yet, despite the overwhelming fear that hung over them, there must have been an incredible amount of resilience within the family. How could one survive under the constant shadow of death, knowing that nothing they did could change the outcome? Perhaps it was this resilience, this perseverance in the face of something beyond their control, that allowed them to continue living. They didn't surrender to despair entirely, but instead tried to push forward, living, loving, and surviving as best they could despite the curse that clung to them like a second skin. Even those who were most affected by the curse may have tried, in their own ways, to carve out moments of peace, to find meaning in their short lives. For some, this might have been the pursuit of relationships, for others the quest for knowledge or personal fulfillment, and for some, perhaps a simple desire to be remembered, to leave behind a legacy that would transcend the curse. For the rest of the world outside the family, however, the curse remained a chilling enigma. It wasn't just a matter of feeling pity for the family. It was something more, something that made people uncomfortable, something that hinted at an underlying truth about life that many people would rather ignore. This family's existence, their ongoing saga, was a living example of mortality and the frailty of human existence, stripped of any sense of false optimism. The curse wasn't just about one family's misfortune, it was about the nature of fate itself, and the ways in which human beings, no matter how hard they try to control their circumstances, are often powerless in the face of it. The townspeople, too, found themselves caught up in this realization. They could not help but confront the uncomfortable truth that they, too, were subject to the same forces that had gripped the family. Their own lives, too, could end at any moment, at a moment of time that no one could predict. But as the family continued to grapple with their fate, another, deeper question began to emerge. Was the family's curse really as random as it seemed? Was it simply a bizarre quirk of nature that had tied them to this one date, or was there something more purposeful, something more deliberate behind the pattern of death that had taken hold of them for generations? Could there be a hidden meaning to their deaths, a deeper explanation that transcended superstition and science? This question became one of the most haunting aspects of their story, the idea that there might be an answer out there, one that no one had yet uncovered, that could explain the terrible consistency of their deaths. Was this an accident, or was there a force, whether human or supernatural, that was actively orchestrating their demise? The theory that the family's deaths were somehow tied to an ancient, unresolved wrong, perhaps a sin committed by one of their ancestors, gained traction over time. Some in the community began to look into the family's history, tracing their lineage as far back as they could. What they found, however, was not immediately helpful. There were no obvious signs of foul play or hidden secrets in the family's past. There were no criminal records or scandals that could explain the curse. Still, some insisted that it had to be something in their history, something buried deep within their bloodline. It was a tantalizing idea, one that suggested that the family's fate was not a random act of nature, but the consequence of something much more profound, a sin or mistake made long ago that had tainted their bloodline for eternity. The search for answers, however, led only to more confusion and unanswered questions. The deeper people delved into the family's past, the more elusive the truth became. No ancestor could be identified as the source of the curse. No event in their family's history seemed to explain the deaths. This led to an unsettling realization. Perhaps the family was not cursed in the traditional sense, but instead bound by something even more inexplicable, something that existed beyond human understanding. Perhaps it was fate itself, in its purest and most terrifying form, that was the true force behind the deaths. There were those, however, who rejected the idea that this was simply a tale of supernatural fate. In their minds, there had to be a rational explanation, even if that explanation was still elusive. This group turned to the emerging field of psychology, trying to understand the mental and emotional toll of living in a family that was repeatedly affected by death on the same day. Could it be that the knowledge of their fate was so deeply ingrained in their subconscious minds that it had somehow triggered their deaths? Some theorists suggested that the family members' belief in their fate was so strong that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Their minds, under the constant pressure of living with such knowledge, might have played a role in their own demise, perhaps by triggering stress-induced conditions or other factors that could lead to premature death. It was a fascinating theory, one that suggested that the mind, when faced with overwhelming pressure, could somehow force the body to conform to the expectations of fate. Yet, even this theory was not widely accepted, as the idea that the mind could have so much control over life and death seemed too far-fetched, even to the most rational thinkers. The family situation was, in many ways, a tragic reflection of the limits of human understanding. Whether the deaths were the result of a curse, a psychological phenomenon, or something else entirely, the truth remained out of reach. In the absence of definitive answers, the family continued to live under the shadow of their fate, while the town around them tried to make sense of their mysterious existence. The idea that there might be some sort of cosmic design behind the family's deaths lingered in the air, adding a layer of mystery and terror to their story. Some saw the family as a tragic example of human vulnerability, a stark reminder that we are all ultimately subject to forces beyond our control, no matter how much we fight against them. But amidst all the fear and speculation, there was something undeniably human about the family story. They were not just victims of fate, they were individuals who tried to make the best of their lives despite the curse that loomed over them. In a way, their resilience was a defiance of the fate that seemed to have bound them. Perhaps it was this resilience, the way they continued to live and love despite the heavy burden they carried, that made their story so compelling. It was a testament to the human spirit, an enduring force that, even in the face of impossible odds, continues to strive, to find meaning, and to survive. And so, the family's legacy continued, stretching across generations, defined by a singular, haunting pattern that no one could explain. Their deaths, once seen as a tragic anomaly, became a symbol of something much larger, a reminder that life, no matter how fragile or short, is precious, and that no matter how much we may try to control our destiny, we are all subject to the whims of fate, and sometimes, fate's plans are darker and more mysterious than we can ever imagine. The family story would continue to reverberate throughout history, not just as a tale of supernatural horror, but as a deeply human story of survival, loss, and the pursuit of meaning in the face of the unknown.